Hello, and welcome today's lesson on word use in poetry. I like to call it shades of meaning. And much like as you would see in the color square here, when we look at something such as the concept of purple, we'll find that when we actually look at the concept, there's quite a few shades that make up purple, and then words that describe purple as well, right? So we can say purple, and that's a very general concept. But if we look closer, we find that there's a bunch of words such as bright lilac, orchid, electric purple, French violet, that describe the color in more detail, varying on how it is. Most words work like this, and we want to play around with the words that are more specific when we're writing poetry because we want each word to have the most potent meaning. So there's a couple of words we're going to be going over today. The concept of denotation, connotation, precise wording, mood, pun, and pruning are all things that you should understand by the end of this lesson. And so the first thing we need to understand about words is words have two different meanings. There's the denotation, which is the dictionary definition of the word. That's typically what we think of when a word has a meaning, but there's also the connotation, which is the emotional meaning of the word. Connotation arises as people use the word over and over again. And if the word is used over and over again in connection with negative things, the word gets a negative connotation. If it's used over and over again in connection with positive things, it gets a positive connotation. So let's take a look at what I mean when I talk about this. And so think of how many words you can think of that mean the same thing as fat. These are all going to have the same denotation. You might think of words like thick, full, heavy, round, fluffy, flabby, obese, chubby, large, overweight, rotund, or plump. All of these words share the same denotation, right? They all mean having a large amount of excess flesh, right? So they all have the same denotation, but they're not all quite the same, right? These words are different emotionally. And so some of them are more positive, such as thick, full, fluffy, chubby, round, or plump. You probably wouldn't have your day completely ruined by being called one of these things. Whereas some of these words have a much more negative connotation, such as round, flabby, obese, large, overweight, or heavy. And if you got called one of these things, you'd just be like, oh man, like this is really terrible. And so not all words have a high connotation. So some are kind of vanilla. They're like vanilla ice cream. They're pretty plain. They're pretty straightforward. What you see is what you get. And then some are like Ben and Jerry's with 100 different toppings and mix-ins in there, and it's all mixed together, and it makes kind of a crazy concoction. And so for example, we have a low connotation vanilla word here when we look at a word like residence, right? That's a place somebody lives. A home is also a place somebody lives, but home has a very high connotation. It's connected to everything we know about being at home and things like that, right? If you call somebody your significant other, it's a very low connotation, very descriptive word, but higher connotation would be boyfriend or girlfriend. There are associations that go along with those words. A group is a low connotation word, whereas you say a gang or a club, immediately if you say, hey, I'm going to go get together with the gang, it's going to sound like you're going to go rob somebody, right? Because a gang has a very negative connotation, but really its denotation is just a group of people. Whereas a club has a more positive connotation because it sounds like something that people belong to, something that's working towards a goal. If somebody calls you different, it's not really a high connotation. It just means you're different than somebody else. Somebody calls you weird, it is a negative connotation. It means you're different in a bad way, right? Old versus ancient, or dirty versus grimy. So not all words are high connotation. Some are low connotation, some are high. But it's going to be up to you as the poet to understand which words are which and use the ones that are most appropriate for your writing. Now, we have this comedian, George Carlin, who has a very particular feeling about what he calls soft language. And I'll let you decide what you think soft language is as you watch this video.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms or euphemistic language. And American English is loaded with euphemisms because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. And it gets worse with every generation. For some reason, it just keeps getting worse. I'll give you an example of that. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables. Shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that. But it didn't happen. And one of the reasons is because we were using that soft language, that language that takes the life out of life. And it is a function of time. It does keep getting worse. Give you another example. Sometime during my life, toilet paper became bathroom tissue. I wasn't notified of this. No one asked me if I agreed with it. It just happened. Toilet paper became bathroom tissue. Sneakers became running shoes. False teeth became dental appliances. Medicine became medication. Information became directory assistance. The dump became the landfill. Car crashes became automobile accidents. Partly cloudy became partly sunny. Motels became motor lodges. House trailers became mobile homes. Used cars became previously owned transportation. Room service became guest room dining. And constipation became occasional irregularity. When I was a little kid, if I got sick, they wanted me to go to the hospital and see the doctor. Now they want me to go to a health maintenance organization or a wellness center to consult a healthcare delivery professional. Poor people used to live in slums. Now the economically disadvantaged occupy substandard housing in the inner cities.
Okay. And so what George Carlin is getting at here is that what he calls soft language is typically what's called low connotation language. And he makes it sound negative, but it's not. It's really not, because here he's really just kind of thinking as a poet, and he wants to get the most emotional impact from every single word and from every single phrase. And so while terms like post-traumatic stress disorder are technically more accurate, right? There's a lot of people who suffer from PTSD who never actually had a shell go off near them, and they're shocked. And so it doesn't really describe what's really happening, but it lacks the emotional punch. And so as a poet, what you want to do is you want to recognize whether the words you're using have that emotional punch or whether or not they're being the kind of softer, more descriptive language, because you want to use both depending on what you're trying to get through in your poem. If you want something to be more subtle and to avoid those rough edges, you want to use the language that's more subtle and avoids rough edges. If you want your words that kind of punch your audience in the gut, you want to be using those high connotation words that George Carlin seems to prefer. And so let's take a look and let's see if you can just identify which word of the two has the most connotation, or of the three. Is it offspring, children, or progeny? Which one has the most connotation? It's usually the one that is used the most, right? And so hopefully you said children, because children is used quite often. It brings the association with childhood, which most people went through. Very few people skip their childhood. And it doesn't sound as clinical or medical as offspring or progeny, right? These are words that people typically are not very familiar with, so they're not super connotative. They might have a connotation of being more like having something that a doctor or a scientist might say. Brother or sibling? Hopefully you're noticing that it would be brother. If you go around being like, hello, this is my sibling, people will be like, oh, you guys don't like each other, do you? All right, I see. Prison or detention center? Hopefully you notice that prison is the one that has a higher connotation, right? If you said, oh, my dad's in a detention center, the person who's listening to you would be like, wait, you mean prison? And then they'd be like, well, why are you not saying prison? Are you trying to make it sound better? And so let's take a look. Let's take a look at some connotative words. Which one has the most positive connotation? Old-fashioned, out of date, or obsolete? They all have the same denotation, but hopefully you're noticing that one of them is a little bit more positive than the rest, and that's old-fashioned, because out of date and obsolete sound like they don't work anymore, or they're no longer able to function, right? That's their connotation. Whereas old-fashioned sounds like it still works, it's just out of style. Small, little, or petite? I believe petite has the most favorable connotation because the other two are very comparative, right? If you're small, you're smaller than somebody else. If you're little, once again, it means you're little compared to other people. Whereas petite is just its own thing, its own definition that's not really being compared to any other sizes. Prosperous, rich, moneyed, or opulent? Hopefully, I think you would see that either prosperous or rich would have the most favorable connotation, although rich, I think, is getting a negative connotation recently as we're seeing, the rise of the super wealthy, and there's quite a bit of resentment going towards them. Moneyed makes it sound like it's old money that you didn't earn. You're just like a trust fund baby. And opulent makes it sound like you're throwing your wealth around in a way that's really irresponsible. How about this one? Brainy, intelligent, or smart? I think the most favorable connotation of this one would be intelligent, right? Brainy sounds like you're showing off. Smart makes it seem, there's a connotation and the association with things like smart aleck or smart ass, which are, not good things to be called. Whereas intelligent is just pretty straightforward. It just means that you have extra intelligence. And so in addition to highly connotative language, some words are just more precise than others, right? And so words have varying degrees of precision. Some are very general, and some are very precise. And so an imprecise or a general word will tell you what something is or what it's doing, but it doesn't tell you much more than that. Whereas a precise word tells you what it is or what it's doing, but also what kind of thing it is and how it's doing it, right? And so if we look at the word said here, said is an imprecise word. It's a general word. It tells what somebody's doing, but it doesn't really tell how they're doing it. But if I say called or cried or demanded, asked, stated, shouted, whimpered, questioned, replied, exclaimed, all these things tell what somebody is doing and also how they're doing it, right? If I say laughed, right, it's going to be a general kind of imprecise word. We know somebody's laughing, but we don't know how, right? If we say snickered or giggled or roared or chuckled or chortled, I don't know why crawled is on there, cackled, howled, tittered, or bellowed, right? Those are all very precise ways of showing how somebody is laughing. And then it's not just verbs like said and laughed, it's also words like man. If you just say the man, right, that's not very precise. What kind of man is it? Is it a lumberjack, a doctor, a wrestler, a father, a soldier, an executive, a college student, a custodian, clerk, criminal? Like what kind of person this is. And so if you combine precise language and highly connotative language, you pack more meaning into your poems, which is really what you want to do in the end. Or if you're not doing that, there's a reason why you're not doing it. And so if we want to use more connotative and precise language here, I can take a neutral sentence like the cold wind blew and made the trees move, right? That sounds pretty prosy. It sounds like a word that would be used in non-poetic language. Whereas if I were to change that and make it all precise words and highly connotative words, I would say something instead like the frigid gale gusted and torqued the boughs, right? It sounds more interesting and it's more precise in what is happening in the sentence, right? It's more descriptive. Another example could be I have a neutral sentence like the dog walked down the street, right? It's pretty vague. It's pretty general. It'd be hard to specifically imagine what kind of dog this is, how it's walking down the street, or what kind of street it's on, right? If I said the mutt ambled along the alley, though, it'd be said you could imagine instead what it is doing. Or if the hound hobbled between the homes, now we know that it's a hound. It's kind of has a problem walking, and it's probably in the suburbs if it's between the homes, right? And so using these languages allows you to get more meaning into the same space. And this is really what poetry is all about, right? You want more intense and complex meaning. You want it to be easier to imagine for your audience, and you want a more impactful sound. And like we talked about in the sound lesson, sometimes the adjectives or the synonyms that you use, you might choose them for the way they sound, in addition to the way that they mean, right? Here, the mutt ambled along the alley. I'm using alliteration and the L consonants in here to make it sound a little bit more impressive, right? And so here, the hound hobbled between the homes. There's a little bit of consonants going on with the B's there, right? And so you want to be aware of the wide variety of words that you have to use. And sometimes, you just need to practice this. And so take a minute and come up with a low connotation sentence on your own. Something like, I went to go get some stuff, right? That is probably the least detailed sentence you could ever imagine, right? And then try to make it more connotative and descriptive. I rushed to grab some groceries. Now, I went to get some stuff. The reader really has no idea what you're talking about. But when you say, I rushed to grab some groceries, that's much more specific. They can imagine what that looks like. So take a minute and pause the video and try to come up with a low connotation sentence and then turn it into a higher connotation sentence. Okay, welcome back. And so sometimes it helps if you have quite a few synonyms and you don't really know how to consider them or how to keep them all straight. You may want to consider putting them in a rank, right? And so you can use a sentence to help you out. For the sentence I'm going to use on this one, I think your outfit is blank. Sometimes putting the words into a sentence will help you understand them, whereas just looking at them in a dictionary will not, right? And so you would want to rank them from the most positive version of the word to the most negative. And usually the most negative is the easiest one to figure out. And so which one would be the most offensive if somebody said, I think your outfit is blank? I'm assuming if somebody said, I think your outfit is dismaying, you'd be like, oh my God, what's going on with my outfit today, right? Ask your one, which one would you most like to hear? Well, I think your outfit is spectacular, right? Which one would be right in the middle where you're just like, I don't know if this is good or bad, but thank you. Probably something like surprising. I think your outfit is surprising. It's just like in a good way or a bad way, right? And then you can kind of fill in the rest of the words on the line, right? And so here they all come. And if you needed to choose a word and you needed to choose it somewhere along the line and you wanted maybe not the most positively connotative one, but something that was just a little bit positive, you might choose like stunning or amazing. Whereas if you wanted something that was a little bit negative, you might say staggering or shocking, right? And you have all these words. All these words have the same denotation, right? and that's causing some kind of surprise, right, or interest. And the difference is the association we have with them. And so you'll actually be doing something very similar to this on your in your practice assignment. But let's move on. Another thing I want you to consider when you're doing your writing is the mood of your poem, right? And so the mood of the poem is the general feeling it gives the reader. And you can use your word choice to give your reader a certain feeling when they're reading your poem, because poetry is really dependent on mood. And the poet, you carefully select the words with a similar connotation or a similar denotation, and it creates this feeling for you. And so here in Robert Frost's poem, Desert Places, let's see how he builds a lonely mood. He says, snow falling and night falling fast, oh fast. In a field I looked into going past, and the ground almost covered smooth in snow, but a few weeds and stubble showing last. The woods around it have it, it is theirs. All the animals are smothered in their lairs. I am too absent spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares. And lonely as it is, that loneliness will be lonely ere it will be more lonely ere it will be less. A blanker whiteness of benighted snow, with no expression, nothing to express. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between the stars on stars where no human race is. I have it in me so nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. And so here, if we take a look at it, we can see that he's using a lot of words that build up this concept of being a deserted or lonely or isolated or by himself, right? I probably could have included night falling, right? Because typically when night comes, people disappear. But we also have like the ground almost covered in snow. Typically, people disappear and go inside when there's snow. There's not even much plants, right? Just a few weeds and stubble. Even the plants are disappearing. All the animals are smothered in their lairs. It's absent, lonely, blank, no expression, nothing, empty space. The space between stars, which is black of the sky, which is empty, no human race, desert places, right? All of these words work together to create this mood of loneliness. And so you can manage the mood of your poem by using quite a bit of words that increase that feeling, in addition to just the message of what it is that you're saying. Another thing to consider when you're using words is to look for things that are called puns. And puns tend to happen when a word acquires two definitions, or one sound of a word has two definitions, right? And so, for example, the word night. We could say night, but there are two definitions for night. There's the nighttime and then the knight in armor. And so the same sound has two denotations. And so in poems, poets tend to play with these multiple meanings to mean two things at the same time, right? And so this is what's called a pun, or a play on words. And here in Shakespeare, in Romeo and Juliet, Romeo says, give me the torch. I am not for this ambling, but being but heavy, I will bear the light, right? And so here he says being but heavy. And so when he says I will bear the light, he means that he's going to hold the thing that's making light. But he's also comparing it to heavy, so it's like light like a feather. And so this light has kind of double meaning here, right? Or in Alice in Wonderland, where the mouse says, mine is a long and sad tale, said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. It is a long tale, certainly, said Alice, but looking down with it wonder at the mouse tail, why do you call it sad, right? So the mouse says that it has a sad tail, like a story, and Alice looks at his actual tail, like on his back. And so typically this will either be funny or a misunderstanding or something like that, that can add meaning to the poem. And so you should be aware of puns, and anytime you can use them. I think silly puns tend to get a lot of heat, but I think a well-used double meaning pun can be really effective in poetry. And then finally, I want you to be aware of a process that you're going to want to use in your poems that I call pruning. So just as important as adding the most meaningful and connotative words into your poem is cutting out the words that don't need to be there, right? Poetry doesn't need to be strictly grammatical. And so sometimes the words we put in there to explain or to make perfect grammar clutter up the poem and make it not as good as what it could be. And so oftentimes you'll find yourself needing to prune or cut things from your poem. And I have an example of a student poem here that needs to be pruned, right? So in her poem, she says, all of these things I strive to do, those of interest and those to deflect consequence. I can do but one or the other, for I am mortal, and the life for me is everything but endless. Though my existence is not about how much, rather it is what. So the feeling of emptiness is not for me, because with the time I have to be, I will choose to do what I strive, that of which I will be happy with for the rest of my life, and that, I say, is the key to life. Okay, here. If I were to take a look at this, I would see a lot of this that is pretty much just trying to be grammatical, but really cluttering up the poem. I would probably recommend cutting these crossed out words, things like of these, but, for, and, though, because, right? These explanation words don't necessarily need to be there because a proficient reader will understand the relationship between these things, right? And so let's take a look at the pruned poem. Instead, it is all things I strive to do, those of interest and those to deflect consequence. I can do one, I am mortal, life is everything but endless. My existence is not how much, rather it is what. The feeling of emptiness is not for me, with the time I have, I choose to strive. That I will be happy with for the rest of my life. That, I say, is the key to life. And so you can see it's much less cluttered, much less wordy. The unnecessary words are not in there, and the meaning is still more or less there. Maybe it has a higher chance of being slightly misunderstood, but those misunderstandings can actually add to the poem in a way because it'll allow a reader to interpret your poem in more than one way, which is another thing that can be really interesting. And so you really want people to be able to interpret your poem multiple ways. And so, looking at the essential vocabulary, hopefully you understand the main concepts here: denotation, connotation, mood, precise language, pun, and pruning. Now, let's take a look at your practice assignment. Hello, students. Welcome back. Let's take a look at your poetry assignment for Lesson 5, Mastering Connotation. Really, what the purpose of this is I want you to get I want to make sure that you know how words and even slight changes in words can impact the feeling of your sentences. And so what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you look at words and look at the subtle differences between words to show yourself and me that you can rank these things and you can determine which ones have certain connotations. And so here's an example of what I want you to do. In the very middle of this box here, there'll be a word like thin. It's supposed to be a pretty neutral word. What I want you to do is I want you to look up at least 6 synonyms that mean the same thing, right? Now, it should mean the same thing, right? And so sometimes I've seen students, they'll put words that mean positively means skinny or thin up here, and down here they'll switch to opposite meaning, which would be like fat, and they put words that are fat. No, the word should still mean the same thing, but these ones have the more negative connotation, right? So in the middle, I put the word thin, and typically, if you want to call somebody thin in a way that seems positive, you call them skinny, slender, lean, svelte, or slim, right? However, if you wanted to call somebody thin in a way that makes them seem negative, you call them lanky, bony, emaciated, or anorexic, right? And so I said that, and so I put them in this order from this being the most positive, the thing that I would most like to be called, or the word that I would like to most have used for me, down to the most negative, which is the one I'd least like to have used to describe me. And I put an explanation as to why. I said the negative words associated with being thin usually have a connotation of being somehow unhealthy. Emaciated and anorexic were unhealthy and therefore the most negative. Positive words related to being thin usually imply either strength or beauty, right? And so the connotation, there's nothing in there that says slim is strong and beautiful, and anorexic, well, anorexic is does literally mean unhealthy. But the connotation varies depending on the word. And so down here we have different words such as beautiful, ugly, bad, good. I want you to look up their synonyms and then put them in order from which word means the most negative to the most positive, and put them in the box above or below. These ones being the negative words, these ones being the positive words. And then just tell me a little bit why you put them in that order. And so you'll see that there are a couple charts of this. Then we have new, old, want, and make. And then think, work, and then choose a word of your own. So choose some other word that you know of that has a lot of synonyms, and then do the same thing for those, right? So this is part one. Just get some words out there and put them in order, rank them from most positive to most negative. This will show me that you really kind of understand the differences between words. Now, a lot of you are going to be finding words you don't know. If you don't know the word, it means that you really don't have a connotation associated with it. So try to find synonyms that you more or less know or have heard, or they have some kind of emotional meaning to you. Keep scrolling down, and we have activity 2. And we have this sentence here. I thought about the beautiful or ugly things that I made, right? What I want you to do is I want you to take this sentence and I want you to change it so that you're changing the only words you're changing are thought, either beautiful or ugly, and made, right? And you're keeping the rest of the sentence the same, but you're replacing them with a synonym. And so if you say, I contemplated, or let's say pondered, I suppose you can take out about if you need to, like I pondered about. That doesn't really make sense. I pondered the beautiful, let's change that to gorgeous. Things should stay the same. Oh, actually, we can change things too. And made, crafted. And then things, let's change that to items, right? And so we started out with a sentence where I said, I thought about the beautiful, ugly things that I made. And then I changed that to, I pondered the gorgeous items I crafted, right? And so what is the slight difference in meaning between those two things, right? And so here we're doing a couple things. We're changing words to words that have a higher connotation or just more specificity, right? Crafted is a more specific word than made. And so you want to do that 5 times. So change the word, change the synonyms, move them around, and see how the sentence looks. Then what I want you to do is I want you to choose 2 of those sentences that you changed, put them down here, and then tell me, how does the meaning and the connotation of the sentence change as the words change? So what were those slight changes in words that you did? And how did they change the overall meaning and feel of the sentence? If you can do this, you have a pretty good idea of how your connotation is working in your sentence. And so this is your activity for lesson 5, which is mastering connotation and word use, right? And so if you have any questions, be sure to come to class with those and we can answer those, especially on Tuesdays. And otherwise, I hope you guys enjoy doing this exercise and it helps you improve your poetry.